The centerpiece was a 7-tier cake surrounded by imported orchids. That's the first thing I noticed when I walked into the Grand Pavilion at Harborview. 300 guests in black tie, a string quartet playing something I didn't recognize, and a cake that probably cost more than my first truck. I stood in the doorway, in my rented tuxedo, the one my son had specifically asked me to wear, and thought, this is the day I've been waiting for. Then the event coordinator touched my arm and said, Mr. Calloway, I need to show you to your table. I assumed she meant the head table. I had written a check for $62,000 to make this night happen. My son was getting married, and I had given everything I had to give. I followed her past the dance floor, past the sweetheart table with its crystal candelabras, past the round tables with gold-rimmed place cards, all the way to the back of the room, near the emergency exit, table 17. There were 2 other people already seated there. I didn't recognize either of them. One was an older woman in a floral dress who smiled at me politely. The other was a young man on his phone who didn't look up. I stood there for a moment, looking at the card with my name on it. Harold Calloway, written in the same calligraphy as every other card in the room. As if I were just another guest. As if I were a co-worker from an old job. Someone my son had felt obligated to invite. Not the man who raised him alone from the age of 9. Not the man who worked double shifts for 11 years so he could go to Purdue without taking out a single loan. Not the man who had handed over his savings account, every dollar of it, when my son called me 8 months ago and said Brittany wanted the wedding of her dreams. I pulled out the chair and sat down. 63 years old. Hands that have framed houses, poured concrete, fixed every broken thing in every home we ever lived in. I sat at table 17 near the emergency exit, and I watched my son take photographs near the orchids, laughing, his arm around his new wife's waist, and he didn't look for me once. Let me go back to the beginning, because this story didn't start tonight. It started a long time ago, in a way that I'm only now able to see clearly. My wife, Carol, died when our son Ryan was 9 years old. Ovarian cancer. She was 41. We had 17 years together, and I would trade everything I've ever built just to have one more Tuesday morning with her, drinking coffee at the kitchen table while she read the newspaper out loud to me. That was her thing. She'd read the headlines in a fake, serious voice and then make up her own endings to the stories. She was the funniest person I've ever known. After she died, it was just the 2 of us, me and Ryan, in a 3-bedroom house in Carmel, Indiana, figuring out how to exist without the person who had held us both together. I'm not going to tell you I did everything right. I worked too much. I missed school plays. There were years where I was so hollowed out by grief that I was physically present but emotionally somewhere else entirely. I know that. I carry it. But I also know what I gave. I know the overtime I worked. I know the vacations I didn't take. I know the retirement contributions I skipped so that Ryan could have the baseball camp he wanted, the car he wanted, the college he wanted. I know the Friday nights I spent helping him with calculus at the kitchen table when I barely understood it myself. I know every single thing I gave because I gave it willingly, and I never once asked for anything in return, except maybe this is a foolish thing to admit to feel like I mattered to him. Ryan met Brittany 3 years ago at a work conference in Chicago. She's from Scottsdale, comes from a family that measures success in zip codes. Her father is a commercial real estate developer. Her mother chairs charity boards. They are the kind of people who have a guest house that is nicer than most people's main house. When Ryan brought her home for Thanksgiving the first time, she looked around my kitchen like she was taking mental notes on what needed to be replaced. I tried. I want to be honest about that. I tried with Brittany. I took her to dinner. I asked about her work. I listened to her talk about renovation plans for an apartment she and Ryan hadn't even leased yet. I complimented her. I was warm. I was patient. But something shifted after the engagement. It was subtle at first. Ryan would call less. When I called him, the conversations felt rushed, like he was half listening. Brittany started answering his phone sometimes, which I thought was strange. Then Ryan told me they were buying a condo in River North, Chicago, and he mentioned almost as an aside that Brittany's father was helping with the down payment. I said that was generous. I meant it. Then the wedding planning started. The first conversation we had about it, Ryan was excited. He put me on speaker, I could hear Brittany in the background, and he walked me through what they were envisioning. The Harborview venue, the tasting menu, the imported flowers. the photographer who had shot 3 celebrity weddings. The number he gave me at the end of that call was $62,000. I was quiet for a moment. "Dad, you there?" "I'm here," I said. That's a big number, Ryan. Brittany really has a vision for this," he said. "And her parents are contributing too, so..." I asked how much her parents were contributing. There was a brief pause. "They're handling the rehearsal dinner." I did the math on that later. The rehearsal dinner at the restaurant they'd chosen would have run maybe $4,000 or $5,000. I was being asked for $62,000 while her family wrote a check for $5,000. I said yes anyway. Because he was my son. Because Carol would have wanted him to have a beautiful wedding. Because I had the money, it was most of what I'd saved over 30 years. But I had it, and because some part of me believed that this gesture, this enormous act of love, would mean something to him. I liquidated a CD, moved money from 2 accounts, and wired the full amount 4 months before the wedding. Ryan sent me a text that said, "Thanks, Dad. Means a lot." A text. No call. No visit. A text with no punctuation. I told myself it was fine. He was busy. Wedding planning is stressful. I told myself a lot of things. Over the next 4 months, I was consulted about exactly nothing. I asked Ryan once if he needed me to help coordinate anything, if there were vendors to meet with, if he wanted me to come to Chicago for a weekend. He said they had a coordinator handling everything. I asked if I was still giving a toast at the reception. He said he'd get back to me on that. He never got back to me on that. 2 weeks before the wedding, I called to confirm the rehearsal dinner details. Brittany answered. She told me that the rehearsal dinner was going to be a smaller, more intimate event, just immediate family and the wedding party. I said I understood. I was his father. I'd be there. She said, "Actually, Harold, we were thinking it might just be our family and the wedding party." She paused. Brittany's parents thought it would be less complicated. I asked Ryan to call me. He did, that evening, and when I brought it up, he said, "Dad, it's just a dinner. It's not a big deal. We'll see you at the ceremony." His voice had that particular flatness that people use when they've already been told what to say. I didn't go to the rehearsal dinner. I drove to Indianapolis the night before the wedding and stayed at a hotel downtown. I ordered room service and watched a baseball game and tried not to think about the fact that my son was at a rehearsal dinner 30 minutes away and hadn't wanted me there. I called my old friend Dennis, who has been my best friend since we were 22 years old, working the same job site in Broad Ripple. I told him what was happening. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "Hal, what are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to the wedding. He's my son." Dennis said, "And after?" I didn't answer him that night. So here I am, table 17, near the emergency exit. The string quartet has shifted to something upbeat, and a few couples have moved to the dance floor. A waiter comes by with a tray of champagne, and I take a glass. The older woman in the floral dress introduces herself as a cousin of Brittany's from Tempe. We make small talk. She has kind eyes, and she mentions her grandchildren, and I listen and I smile, and inside I am very, very still. I watch Ryan dance with Brittany, and he looks happy. I want to say I felt nothing looking at him, but that would be a lie. I felt everything. I felt 23 years of everything. I felt the nights I slept in the recliner next to his bed when he had pneumonia at age 12 because I was afraid to leave the room. I felt the morning I drove 4 hours to Purdue at 2 in the morning because he called me crying about a girl, and I just thought, I'll go. I'll just go. I felt the afternoon I handed him a check that represented 30 years of waking up before sunrise and coming home after dark, and I watched him fold it and put it in his pocket and say, "Thanks, Dad." I took out my phone and I sent Dennis a text. "I'm at table 17, near the back exit." He replied immediately. "You serious?" "Yeah. What do you need?" "Nothing yet. Just wanted someone to know." At some point during dinner, a dinner I could barely taste, Ryan came to my table. It was brief. He was moving through the room, doing his rounds, stopping at each table with Brittany on his arm. When he reached table 17, he leaned down and gave me a side hug. Brittany smiled, the smile she uses for things she has to do. Ryan said, "Dad, glad you made it." Then they moved on to the next table. "Glad you made it." Like I was someone who had driven through traffic to get here. Like I hadn't paid for every orchid in this room. Like I wasn't the person who made sure he existed long enough to stand in this ballroom in a tuxedo with a woman he loves. I stayed through the first dance. I watched them move under the lights. And I thought about Carol, about how she would have cried all the way through this, happy tears, and how she would have made me dance with her afterward, even though I've always been a terrible dancer. I thought about what she would say if she were here tonight and could see where they'd put me. I thought she would have been heartbroken. And I thought that maybe, just maybe, that would have mattered to Ryan. Maybe if she were alive, none of this would be happening. But she's not alive. And it is. I waited until the cake was cut. I watched Ryan and Brittany feed each other cake and laugh for the photographer. I clapped with everyone else. Then I folded my cloth napkin, placed it on the table, picked up my jacket, and walked out through the emergency exit. Outside, it was a cool October night, the kind of evening Carol always called sweater weather. I stood in the parking lot for a moment and breathed. No drama, no scene. I just left. I drove back to the hotel and I sat on the edge of the bed and I thought carefully for about an hour. Not about my feelings, I'd deal with those later. I thought about the practical reality of my situation and what it meant. I had given my son $62,000. I had been seated near the back exit with strangers. I had been excluded from the rehearsal dinner. I had received a side hug during table rounds. These were the facts, and I looked at them without flinching. Then I picked up my phone and called Dennis. "It's late," he said. "I know. I need a favor. Anything. Call your brother for me." Dennis's brother is an estate attorney named Patrick. I'd met him at a barbecue years ago, a quiet, steady man who always seemed to know exactly what he was thinking. Dennis called him. Patrick called me back within 20 minutes. I told him what I wanted to do. He said, "We can have documents drafted by Tuesday." I said, "Tuesday is fine." I slept better than I'd slept in months. The next morning, my phone started ringing. I was eating breakfast in the hotel restaurant, eggs, wheat toast, coffee when Ryan's name appeared on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, it rang again. I finished my eggs. The voicemail was brief. His voice sounded different from the night before, tighter. He said, "Dad, hey, give me a call when you get a chance." I drove home to Carmel. He called twice more that afternoon. The second call, I answered. "Hey," he said. "Hey, you left early last night." "I did. We didn't even get to really talk." He paused. Brittany noticed. I said, "I noticed a few things too, Ryan." There was silence on the line. Not the comfortable silence of two people who know each other well, but the other kind. The kind that means something is coming. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means I've been thinking about where I sat last night, about the rehearsal dinner, about a few other things." His voice shifted, not angry, not yet, more like cautious. "Dad, if this is about the seating chart, Brittany had a whole system for that. It wasn't." "I know," I said. "I'm not calling to argue about it." "Then what are you calling about?" "I wanted to hear your voice," I said. "That's all." Which was true. I did. And I wanted him to hear mine steady, calm, not what he might have expected from a man who had just been told, in 100 quiet ways, that his presence was an afterthought. He relaxed slightly. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing much. Before we hung up, he said, "We'll have you over for dinner when we're back from the honeymoon. Brittany wants to do a nice dinner." "Sure," I said. Tuesday. I sat across from Patrick in his office on Meridian Street and we revised my estate documents. Everything, the will, the trust, the beneficiary designations on the investment accounts, the life insurance policy. We spent 3 hours going through it all with precision. And when it was done, my affairs were organized in a way that reflected my actual values and my actual life, not just the assumptions I'd made years ago when Ryan was 12 and the world was different. Patrick asked me once, during a pause in the paperwork, if I was sure. I said, "Patrick, I've never been more sure of anything." He nodded. He didn't push. "I want to be clear about something. What I did on Tuesday was not revenge. I want you to understand the difference, because it matters to me. Revenge would have been cutting him off immediately, making a dramatic phone call, causing a scene at the wedding. What I did was something quieter and, I think, more honest. I made decisions about my own life, my own assets, my own future decisions that should have reflected reality all along. The money I had spent 30 years building was not, it turned out, going to be handed to someone who placed me near the emergency exit. That money was going to go to the people and places that represented what I actually believed in. Some to my niece Rebecca, who had called me every Sunday for the last 15 years just to check in. Some to the trade apprenticeship program at the Union Hall where I'd gotten my first job at 22. Some to the animal shelter Carol used to volunteer at on weekends. Some, still, to Ryan. I'm his father. I'm not capable of removing him entirely, but a smaller portion, structured differently, in a way that Patrick said was legally sound and practically meaningful. I drove home and made dinner. Pasta, nothing fancy. I ate it at the kitchen table with a glass of water, and I looked at the chair across from me where Carol used to sit, and I said out loud, "I handled it, sweetheart." The calls continued over the next week. Ryan, mostly. One call from Brittany's mother, which surprised me, a polished woman, perfectly warm in that practiced way, asking if I'd had a lovely time at the wedding. I told her I'd had a lovely time. We wished each other well, and hung up. Ryan's calls got slightly more frequent. He and Brittany were still on their honeymoon in Portugal, but he was calling more often than he had in the previous 8 months combined. I answered when I felt like it. I kept the conversations pleasant and brief. I asked about Portugal. I asked if they'd had the pastéis de nata. He seemed uncertain about how to read me. On the 4th day after Tuesday, he called in the evening and his voice had shifted again, more direct. I could tell Brittany was nearby. "Dad, I wanted to ask you something." "Go ahead." Brittany and I were talking about the future, and I mentioned that I'd always assumed, you've always said, that when the time came, he stopped, tried again. "I just wanted to check in about your plans, long term." I let the silence sit for a moment. "Plans?" I said. "Yeah. You've been talking about maybe retiring in the next couple years, selling the house. And I guess I just wanted to make sure we were on the same page about—" "Ryan," I said, "I appreciate you asking. I've been doing some planning, actually." "Oh, good." He sounded relieved, which told me everything about why he was asking. "So you've talked to someone?" "I spent Tuesday with Patrick. Dennis's brother, the attorney, revised everything." A pause. "Everything?" "Everything." The quiet that followed was different from all the other quiets in our conversation. I could almost hear him processing it. "Can I ask, did you make any big changes?" I said. "I made changes that I should have made a while ago. Changes that reflect my life as it actually is." He didn't ask any more questions that night. He said he'd call when he was back from Portugal. We said goodbye. I finished my glass of water. He called 3 times the next day. Here's the thing about being 63 that no one really prepares you for. You've spent your whole life building a career, building a home, building a family, building some version of a future that you picture clearly in your mind. And then at a certain point, you realize that the picture was yours. Nobody else signed off on it. The people in it have their own pictures, and sometimes they don't look anything like yours. That's not bitterness. I'm working hard not to let it become bitterness. It's just clarity. What I know is this. I am the man Carol loved. I am the man who showed up, who worked, who stayed, who tried. I am the man who drove 4 hours in the middle of the night because my son was crying about a girl. I have value that has nothing to do with what I can fund. I have stories and knowledge and a sense of humor that Carol used to say could make a bad day survivable. I have friends like Dennis who answer the phone at midnight without asking why. I have Rebecca who calls every Sunday. I have a life. I had allowed that life to be measured against my bank account, and I had agreed, silently, every time I picked up the bill. I stopped agreeing. Ryan and Brittany came for dinner 3 weeks after they were back. Brittany wore something expensive and brought a bottle of wine and was exceedingly pleasant all evening. Ryan helped me clean up after the meal, which he hasn't done since he was a teenager. They sat across from me at the kitchen table, in the chairs where Carol and I used to sit, and I looked at my son, at this man who has my nose, and Carol's stubbornness, and something in his eyes that is entirely his own, and I felt love. Of course I did. That part doesn't go away, but I saw him clearly now, and he was seeing me clearly, maybe for the first time in a long while. The version of me that was just an ATM, just a resource, just a quiet man in the background who would always be there with a check and no complaints, that version was gone. I'd retired him the same week as the wedding, without ceremony. I served coffee. Brittany mentioned that she and Ryan were talking about eventually starting a family. I said I thought that was wonderful. She said having grandparents close by would be so important. I agreed. Ryan looked at me carefully when she said it. I looked back at him the same way. After they left, I stood at the kitchen window and watched their car pull out of the driveway. The street was quiet. The neighbors had their porch light on. A dog was barking somewhere down the block. My phone buzzed. A text from Dennis. How'd it go? I thought about it for a second. Good, I typed back. I think good. He sent back a thumbs up. Then a second text. Carol would have liked this version of you. I stood there for a long time with my phone in my hand. The porch light next door was still on. The dog had stopped barking. The street was quiet and ordinary, and mine. I put the phone down on the counter and I got a glass of water and I stood in my kitchen. The kitchen, I built the cabinets for myself. 26 years ago, with my own hands, and I thought about what I wanted the next part of my life to look like. Not what Ryan wanted. Not what Brittany's family expected. What I wanted. I thought about the fishing trip I'd been putting off for 4 years. I thought about a woodworking class at the community center that Dennis had mentioned. I thought about the fact that my passport had expired and I'd never done anything about it. I thought about the little house Carol grew up in down in Bloomington, how I'd driven past it once and thought, someday I'd like to walk around that neighborhood, just to feel close to her. I'd never done that either. Someday had started to feel like a word I needed to retire. I'm not telling you this story because I want you to be angry at my son. I don't carry that anger myself, or I'm working not to. I'm telling you this because I spent a long time believing that the most loving thing I could do was to give without limit, to make myself small, to ask for nothing, and accept whatever I was offered in return. I believed that was what good fathers did. I believed Carol would have wanted that. But Carol knew me better than I know myself. And she used to say she said it to me more than once, in different ways. Over 17 years, she said, Hal, the people who love you will love you for who you are, not for what you do for them. If someone only loves you for what you do for them, that's not love. That's a transaction. She said that. I remembered it. I just didn't apply it soon enough. I'm applying it now. I went to the filing cabinet in my study after the car was gone, and the house was quiet. In the back of the third drawer, behind old insurance documents and a folder of Ryan's grade school artwork that I've never been able to throw away, there's a photograph. Carol and me at our kitchen table in the old house. Summer 1998. She's reading the newspaper and she's wearing that expression she always had when she was about to make up her own ending to a headline. I'm looking at the camera and I'm laughing at something she must have just said. I held that photograph for a while. Then I put it back, closed the drawer, and went to the other room to find the number for the passport office. I had places to be. If this story reached something in you, something you've been carrying around and not saying out loud, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because here's what I've learned. You cannot demand to be valued. You can't argue someone into treating you with dignity. But you can decide quietly, firmly, without drama, to stop making yourself available to people who haven't earned it. You can decide that your presence is not a given. You can decide that what you've built, what you've survived, what you carry, it matters. It has always mattered. And if the people in your life haven't figured that out yet, well, some lessons have to be learned the hard way. I've never been the kind of man who makes speeches. Carol always said I communicated better with my hands than my mouth, that I could build anything, fix anything, and then stand there completely unable to explain how I'd done it. She thought that was endearing. I thought it was a limitation. Maybe it's both. But I'm saying this now, clearly, for anyone who needs to hear it. 63 years old is not too late to draw a line. It is not too late to stop funding the fantasy and start living your actual life. It is not too late to be the person your late wife always believed you were. You just have to be willing to sit at table 17, recognize it for exactly what it is, fold your napkin, and walk out the door. The rest takes care of itself.